today we're lucky enough to have 4 different planners with us today. We've got Brandon Goldman, the senior planner for the city of Ashland in Oregon. We've got Anthony Raguine. He's a senior planner with Deschutes County, where I work. We've got Noah Burke. He's a senior planner with the city of Santa Fe, New Mexico. And we've got Steve Hopkins from Austin, Texas, who's also a senior planner. So we've asked each of these planners to give us what we'll call a flash presentation. So they've just got a short period of time to give us a little snapshot of what planning looks like related to wildfire in their particular areas. We're going to ask that we hold questions till the end, so we'll go through the 4 presentations from each of the planners, and then we'll have panel discussion at the end. So you can always shoot a question to the chat box, but we'll hold off on having the planners address each of those questions until they each get a chance to give us their initial presentation. So with that, I think I will turn it over to Brandon.
Well, thank you for the introduction. This is Brandon Goldman, City of Ashland. Been with the city for about 20 years now, and during that time we have seen a number of wildfires. You can see our downtown in this photo that has a wildfire that was going on in the background during the time that I took the photo. So, but I wanted to start with the next slide showing a bit of context for the city of Ashland. And so this shows you that Ashland is at the edge of the Siskiyou Mountains and is a very steep forest interface right there. And so you can see it's heavily wooded as well, a small town of about 20,000 people. And the next slide will show where our existing wildfire lands overlay is. So in orange on this illustration is what areas are currently protected in our land use code as requiring fire prevention and control plans and fuels reduction. And those are the areas in the last photo that are up against those mountains. So it's really the urban forest interface. It covers about 1/5 of the city right now. And as I mentioned, it's those areas of steep slopes and heavily forested, as well as larger lots. But looking at where wildfire source points could also come from, vacant areas within the city, as well as embers traveling long distances, we're currently in the process of proposing to extend the wildfire lands overlay to cover the entire city, which is what's shown in pink in that map there. And through that application, extending across the entire city, the development standards for wildfire lands, if you go ahead and advance the slide, those are currently would, relocate that wildfire lands boundary. Some of the fire prevention and control plans and the fuels reduction requirements are currently only required with new subdivisions for fire prevention and control plans, as well as new building additions for fuels reduction requirements. And in looking at that, the Planning Commission, in evaluating an ordinance that was presented to them back in February of last year initially, had concerns that just expanding the wildfire lands, given that most of the area in that expansion area is already largely developed, wouldn't really create opportunities to protect comprehensively neighborhoods because they're not subject to new subdivisions or new single-family homes being built in those areas as frequently. And so the Planning Commission wanted to look at it a little further, as did our Wildfire Lands Commission, and in study sessions with the City Council and Mayor, at looking at a fuel break prohibited plant list, which is the last bullet point you see there. The idea of that would be to actually approach it more comprehensively and establish a list of trees and shrubs that just simply could not be newly planted within the city of Ashland in any area, and potentially going further to set a time period in which those existing plants would have to be removed. We have neighborhoods that were developed in the 50s, 60s, 70s, I guess going back to the 1890s, but for the most part, in the 1960s, 70s, junipers was quite prevalent throughout those neighborhoods. So just having fuel break requirements for new buildings wouldn't really resolve that existing fuel source in those areas. And so taking a more proactive approach and looking at other ways, potentially even outside of the land use code, to require the removal of those plants through a vegetative management practice is where we are at this point in time. So that largely concludes the flash presentation. I know that we're going to have questions and answers. The last slide I have here is just a closing photo of the city of Ashland's downtown area, which was another area of concern when looking at applying fuel break requirements around existing developments. This area largely developed at the turn of the century. You know, many of the properties only have 6-foot side yards between buildings, and so some of those vegetative management practices that apply really well up in that steep slope large lot area would effectively mean the removal of a lot of these evergreen trees from these established neighborhoods. And so that's another point of contention in the community and something that we'll be wrestling with going forward. So that concludes my 5 minutes.
Okay, great. Thanks, Brandon. Next up, we have Anthony from Deschutes County.
Hello, everybody. So in that first slide, you'll see is a picture of the Aubrey Hall fire, and in the foreground is the city of Bend. This is a fairly large fire that came up to the western edge of the city. And so, you know, from the planning perspective, I guess I'll start with just briefly telling you all about how do we handle or did we handle wildfire management. Historically, in land use planning, if the developer for a subdivision, for example, proposed fire fuel breaks, defensible space, we called it good. It was not very comprehensive in the way we handled wildfire hazard. But that all changed 2 years ago with a 50-lot subdivision called Miller Tree Farm, which you'll see in the second slide, they're doing a prescribed burn there. And as part of this land use process, it was really quite interesting. You know, again, historically, Deschutes County had not, as far as land use is concerned, done a very good job in addressing specific mitigation measures for management of wildfire hazard. But during this land use process for this subdivision, opponents to the subdivision asked and really frankly demanded that the county look into more detail regarding the applicant's wildfire protection management plan and wanted some assurances that it would continue. And so through this process, in fact, during the first evidentiary hearing, the hearings officer denied the subdivision, but laid out really an interesting framework for what we're using today. And so again, historically, if you propose your defensible space and at least tried to get annexed into a fire district, we called it good. So then what changed as a result of Miller Tree Farm? On the third slide, I've just got some photos of some documents. During this land use process, again, because of the attention to detail from the opposition, the developer, to their credit, went back and looked at their wildfire protection management plan and added a lot more detail. And so what's interesting as part of this process is not only is there a defensible space for every developable lot and every structural building envelope, but there's a list of fire-resistant plants. As part of this plan, the developer was required to not only initially clear and reduce fire fuel load, but it was required that the HOA and their bylaws not just continue with these methods, but provide a financial security as part of the HOA fees to support the retention of a wildfire consultant permanently on the HOA board, and then annually provide reports to planning, letting us know how is the wildfire mitigation going, are there additional methods or measures that need to be taken to address wildfire hazard. And as part of the HOA bylaws, it was also required that the HOA set aside funds for additional measures. And so we had this very interesting sort of Prior to 2015, very little in terms of conditions of approval or ongoing mitigation measures, to now what we have as a result of Miller Tree Farm, which is some very detailed requirements with ongoing measures that are required then to be reported to the Planning Division. And so as part of the approval, if the developer comes out of compliance, then it's the HOA that's on the hook, and we actually have the ability to deny future building permits within the development based on violations of the Wildfire Protection and Management Plan. And so it's a very huge shift in how Deschutes County handled wildfire hazard mitigation measures, in particular the ongoing measures. And because, as you can imagine, in a heavily forested areas, we also had wildlife concerns. As part of the HOA bylaws, we required that they, in addition to the wildfire consultant, also set aside funds for the retention of a biological consultant, and then required that those two folks meet annually to put together a sort of comprehensive going forward plan to address both wildlife and wildfire. And so it was a very interesting process. It's one of the few that we've had in Deschutes County where you have staff, the jurisdiction approving the development, opposition, and the developer all working together to produce what we feel is a much better product, both today and going forward. And it's really become sort of the gold standard for future development in wildland urban interface areas. And that's all I've got.
Great, thank you, Anthony. Next up, we've got Noah from Santa Fe.
Thank you, and hello, everybody. My name is Noah Burke. I'm a senior planner for the City of Santa Fe, New Mexico. I work in the capacity of working in the land use department as one of 3 planners. I deal with everything from code rewrites to, I'm also the designated neighborhood planner, and I work with all boards and commissions for residential, commercial, and all other types of development. The approach that we have taken here in Santa Fe to integrating the WUI code into actual land use code for development of new and commercial structures is we've actually used an overlay that exists in Santa Fe. On the next slide, you'll see that the overlay is called the escarpment overlay. It essentially is an overlay that was developed in the early 90s that's mapped, that stipulates how you're supposed to build, where you're supposed to build, what types of materials are supposed to be used, and what colors. The idea behind that was that development in our mountains, our higher altitude areas, wouldn't be seen from public areas, such as, our plaza or from freeways coming into Santa Fe. If you were to overlay our wild urban interface map, you would see that the map almost mirrors the escarpment overlay, so they both are the same areas. So we realized that there was a gap here in Santa Fe of what our wildland urban interface fire division was trying to accomplish, and what us as planners were approving here on the ground at the planning desk. So we worked together and we formed a group of stakeholders, including developers, architects, land use personnel, and our fire department, to figure out a side-by-side working approach to how can we solve this gap. And the way we saw this gap is we used existing codes that were already in place to rewrite them and integrate WUI language. And by that I mean that the WUI code itself, as I'm sure most of you are aware, is a very big document in that it's not one size fits all. You can take bits and pieces from that and work in your community. So in Santa Fe, what we did is we went through with the fire department and with our building department and with our stakeholders, and we said, what is applicable to Santa Fe, and how can we put that into our land use code, which is law, and then it becomes enforceable. So the approach we took is that, the goal was to integrate language from the WUI code into our land use development code. On the next slide, you'll see that it basically was a very successful thing. As you can see from this picture, it delineates that we're not breaking ridge tops, we're using materials that are fire resistant, and we're also, we've also integrated approved planting lists that you're required to use around your perimeter of your house. And those plants are low risk burn plants that our fire marshal had chosen and worked with land use that were readily available to our area and that grew at this area. We also integrated language for providing on-site inspections, so we can, before you even come in with your plans, you're able to go out there in the field and find an area that would be best suited for building that fit under our regulations. It allows us to work directly with, the homeowners, the developers, and the architects, and to accomplish two things. One is to lower the risk of wildfire danger, and also to preserve the visual aesthetics, which is the intent, one of the few intents of the escarpment overlay. As I mentioned before, we use building materials. We approve all building materials. We approve all the plantings. We approve the siting. We approve where the cuts for the driveway are, so that it's easily accessible for the fire department. And then we also approve where the plants are being placed so that they can accomplish that. And ultimately, this allows us for a safe and sustainable development that serves, like I said before, protecting our visual aspect and our prized possession mountains and lowering the wildfire danger. And with that, thank you.
Great, thanks, Noah. Next up, we've got Steve Hopkins from Austin, Texas. And I would just say before Steve gets started, folks are thinking of questions for our panel. Feel free to type those out in the chat box for folks. And with that, we'll turn it over to Steve.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, as you said, I'm a senior planner with the City of Austin with the Development Services Department, and I am a case manager with the subdivision review team. So I review subdivision plats, and that's part of how I got involved in this, I guess, the wildfire mitigation planning that's the city is starting to do. Wildfire planning is a new concept in Central Texas, and we're just beginning to address it. But there are some things in our newly adopted comprehensive plan that don't specifically touch on wildfire, but it sort of, some of those policies bleed over to help address wildfire mitigation, such as, flood mitigation, watershed protection, and directing growth away from sensitive environmental areas, and sort of the overall policy of building a compact and connected city. And all that together helps to prevent and mitigate wildfire. So we're a large city, we're about 1 million people. The urban area is just about double that. And this is one of the things that it's becoming more apparent to us that this is a big issue. I've been working with Justice Jones with the fire department, and we're going through a process now to update our land use regulations, and we've been able to incorporate some regulations addressing wildfire in the subdivision code, but what is really going to help us take the next step is adoption of the WUI code, so we can address the structural elements to mitigate and prevent wildfire that we just don't have any ability right now to do that. We've got a map of areas that are at higher wildfire risk. It has not been adopted. Hopefully that would be adopted as part of the WUI code. We do have a regional wildfire plan that has been adopted by the city and the county. So that was the first step. Hopefully the next step will be adoption of the map and the WUI code. And that's really all that I have right now.
Okay, great. Thanks, Steve. So, as you can see, we tried to keep the presentation short just to kind of whet people's appetites and give people a feel for what wildfire planning is looking like in a few places around the country, but really wanted to save a fair amount of the hour that we have for any kind of discussion or questions. And it looks like we've got a couple in the chat box. I don't know if the presenters can just see those or not. Looks like the first one from Emily's for Noah.
Yep, thank you. I'm just reading over that right now. Actually, we do get a lot of pushback at first. It's a very good question. We do, because we do have a lot of say when we are siting structures, when we're requiring materials. And usually the way that we try to address that is that we try to work with the applicant to understand what is the benefit here. Yes, it seems like a lot of over-regulation, a lot of overbearingness, but what is the overall intent and what will this do for me in the future? And to guide them through that light and guide the neighborhoods as well, because I work with neighborhoods in this as well. And so when neighborhoods are, when you have a subdivision that is in our escarpment overlay and we're saying here's the regulations, they design you know, their architectural review standards around our regulations. So it's already there. Once you buy into that subdivision, you've bought into that style. So we do, at this point in time, it is accepted. I mean, this, you know, as we rewrite the code and as we're integrating more of the WUI language as we see it appropriate, like in this next year, we've done a full redrafting of the code. I'm sure that it'll take a few community meetings, some outreach to make people understand, but to ultimately say, yes, it is upfront and a lot of overregulation, but look, in the future, you're going to lessen your risk, and you will be thankful if disaster strikes or if we have one of, you know, a fire in that area.
Great. Yeah, that's one of the things I was thinking about as well, as far as pushback from developer communities, or how much resistance. Any other planners want to chime in on that one before we move on?
Well, I'll chime in for, I guess, just as far as development in Deschutes County. You know, our decision makers historically have been very much pro-development, and so there hasn't been a lot of pushback from the decision maker side. Really, you know, as I talked about Miller Tree Farm, really the pushback came from an advocacy group that really wanted us to take a closer look at it. You know, when you look at our development code, the only language that we have as far as approval criteria that addresses anything close to wildfire is subdivision developers must address how the development impacts or is affected by natural hazards. A super generic approval criterion that turned into, as I mentioned, a much larger template for how we're moving forward. But the pushback really came from the opposition. And when we really took a look at it, again, it was to the developers' credit that they decided, you know what, this is the right thing to do. And really it was sort of a triangle, three parties, the jurisdiction, the opposition, and the developer working together to come up with a plan that everybody was happy with and everybody could live with. And so, you know, from a code side, I know there's another question about codes. We don't have specific wildfire codes. We're working on that. But all of the things that we're seeing out of Miller Tree Farm came out of a very generic approval criterion to address wildfire hazard. And so it came about very organically through the land use process for us.
Great, thanks, Anthony. Yeah, it's an interesting take. Yeah, I guess pushback resistance can come from all angles when we're talking about development, right? So, all right, Michelle had a question asking for any advice or experience with how to use codes and ordinances to manage existing development. And, you know, we talked about a few, like Ashland's prohibited plants list, but any other examples that have actually been implemented and you could point to as a success that people could use as a model?
This is Brandon from Ashland. in terms of what we currently have adopted for that wildfire overlay area, if, for instance, someone is come in and get an addition, they're at that point subject to doing a fuel break and meeting a general fuel break requirements to help protect the property and their neighbors from wildfire. Additionally, if somebody is going to be re-roofing their building, doing more than 50% of the roof structure is going to be modified, at that point we'd also require non-flammable roofing material and piecemeal effort over time to get rid of all the wood shingle roofs that were put on historically. To touch on how this relates to the pushback issue, we don't really get much pushback from the homeowners in terms of that, I think because they have seen in the environment wildfires that have devastating losses. So in a sense, even though it is a requirement that gets imposed on them, typically when people are going through the effort of doing, adding value to their property through an addition or a re-roof, it's relatively easy to let them know that these are the requirements, and we don't really get a lot of concern back in that regard. So those are kind of two existing codes that apply to those established neighborhoods.
Great, thanks. Any other thoughts from the rest of the panel on any other models that you know of that could be emulated elsewhere instead of reinventing the wheel, say?
Well, this is Steve in Austin. When I was working in Springfield, Oregon, we had we did have a WUI overlay, and there were two specific developments that each had a development plan so that on each lot you knew exactly the area you could build, and you knew exactly where your driveway could be placed. And that concept, I don't think, is going to work as well in Austin. We don't have, it's a larger area, and we don't have just the staff to do that level of involvement on each building permit. So I'm trying to figure out what's the best way to address these concerns in this different environment.
Yeah, interesting that the model doesn't always work everywhere, right? You can't necessarily use the cookie cutter approach. Well, I'd encourage other folks to post it. Oh, we got another one here from Michelle. I've also got kind of a list of questions from our survey, which I've got at hand too, but just encourage folks to continue posting in the chat box anything. So Michelle says she lives in extremely rural area with no incorporated cities and one planner for the whole county. So there's a lot on that person's plate. Any advice on how to get wildfire planning on that person's radar? And I was going to ask a similar question to that, is just competing objectives. So I know, like, locally here, our community development department that Anthony works for has spent a whole lot of time in the last year or so on, like, marijuana regulations, for example, and wildfire regulations kind of got set on the back burner for a while. So any thoughts of how to kind of, even if people might recognize it as something important to work on, how to really get it on the top of the list for the planner to work on or forward to?
Yeah, this is Noah from Santa Fe. In New Mexico, we have a lot of, large counties that, have one or two planners. So I am familiar with exactly rural areas and whatnot. I think when you have a planner that's overseeing a county or a large area, the best approach is to try, obviously, to meet with them, but bring, some of the data and the studies. Are there frequency of wildfires? Or, a lot of times if you have one planner, and I can say this, from experience, that we get overwhelmed, and sometimes we're not always able to think for the future. We're working in the current situation instead of being proactive rather than reactive. You can also meet with your county commissioners, you know, and discuss your concerns with them, because those people are going to have the biggest influence over the form of government, or your counselors or commissioners or whatever's in your municipality. So I would say try to meet with the planner to get it on their radar, show them some data also, and show them that other planners around the country are really, you know, integrating this approach. And then, you know, meet with the commissioner. If you live in a really rural area and you're worried about it and it's not being addressed, meet with your county representative and say, look, this is a concern, and you know, I would like you to bring this up at your next meeting, and, you know, try to be vocal in the community.
Yeah, this is Brandon. I would concur with what's been said before, and also add that when Anthony gave his presentation, the concept of having a wildfire specialist as a board member of the HOA seemed to be a brilliant idea in terms of shifting some of that responsibility from the planner's desk to the homeowner and the developments, put it in their court. Because I think as a planner, we don't have a lot of experience with wildfire in terms of implementing codes. We're looking at best practices from elsewhere. So for that rural occupant, going to meet with that planner to get that ball rolling, it does seem that coming forward with some ways in which some of the responsibility for fuels mitigation could be taken on by the homeowners through programs that could be required by the land use code, but not necessarily overseen on a day-to-day basis by that singular planner would be a good idea.
So this is Anthony. You know, I think for us, and I'm going to preface my comment by saying, don't wait for this to happen. But in the case of Miller Tree Farm and this development, it was coming directly on the heels of, and Keith remembers this, the Two Bulls fire that we had here in Deschutes County. So in 2014, we had a large, was it 7,700 acres, I think, Ed?
About that,
somewhere in that range. So we had a very large fire in 2014, and in 2015, we're now going through this land use process with Miller Tree Farm. And I will echo what Noah said, which is coming on the heels of that wildfire, our county Board of County Commissioners was very, very interested in doing whatever they could to, as part of the approval process, to make sure that developers were doing more. And so again, I'm not suggesting you wait for a wildfire to strike, obviously, but it was very lucky for Deschutes County that this development proposal came on the heels of that fire, because it made our board much more receptive to, again, what was a monumental leap forward in terms of wildfire management and mitigation. They were much more interested in having, and you know, it was mentioned earlier, having the developer and now the HOA take on the bulk of the responsibility. So now as a planner, because of this land use process and what Miller Tree Farm is required to do is through the HOA, I have annual reports that I review, but I don't have to be out there monitoring. I'm not, you know, all the building envelopes were already approved. The vegetation list was already approved. It really has been helpful for us in terms of, again, shifting that responsibility off the planner's plate. But in terms of getting on a planner's radar, if your jurisdiction, whoever your decision makers are, if there's no political will there, it becomes a very, very difficult process. And so I think it really starts with the decision makers. And I know in my meetings with our board, it was emphasizing cost in lives, cost in structural damage, the cost in suppression, the potential to lose insurance coverage. There were any number of things that sort of helped that conversation move forward. But it really starts, in my opinion, with the decision makers and the political will to have something through that can be accomplished through the zoning code to help address this issue.
Great, thank you. I'd also open it up if somebody just wants to unmute themselves or isn't on the web portion of this to ask a question over the phone. Feel free to jump in here as well. Hearing none, I've got a couple myself. One would be what kind, if you do any at all, what kind of education and outreach tools do you provide to people that maybe want to do the right thing in development but don't know what that is? Do you have something as part of your permit process where you provide them with plant lists or anything that may be related to development but is not necessarily required by code? Do you have an education process for people looking to build, or have you heard of anybody employing that?
This is Brandon again. Being a small town, we're fortunate in that we're able to largely refer developers or individual homeowners to contact our fire department, but we do also hand out guidelines for fire-wise landscaping and fire-wise construction. When somebody comes into our counter and looking at doing a development on a vacant property or doing an addition. And so those guides give some really general advice in terms of moving forward. But speaking as an individual homeowner in the area, I took advantage of this as an individual in contacting the fire department when having purchased a property, and they were kind enough to come up and do an assessment of the existing home and the landscaping around it. So this is outside of a fire-wise community, but gave really a report in terms of what we would need to do to bring our property better into compliance. And that was very useful to then just go in and remove the trees that were necessary to be removed and remove the landscaping that was up against the windows and those sort of things. And so that is, obviously a case-by-case basis, but really the resource that we rely on is our local fire department to do a lot of that education and outreach.
Great, yeah, so look to your partners that could help with capacity, right? Allison posted a question that was kind of related to what I was actually going to ask. There's a lot of interest, as you can see by the folks that have attended today, in this topic and some expertise they may be able to provide. A lot of folks may work for a local nonprofit or other non-governmental organization and have the expertise, but maybe don't engage with planners on a regular basis. Are there resources or education or training that would help further adoption of planning codes related to wildfire?
Well, this is Stephen in Austin, and I can say that when staff is proposing like adoption of the WUI code or just new regulations related to wildfire that do something more than just attend the hearing for adoption of that, make the leaders, the city council, make them aware that you support this, and if you can, meet with the planners who are in charge of that project and trying to develop that project so that they are aware of what your issues are, and maybe your issues can be addressed in what they're planning as well. Just being more informed and letting the leaders know that you want this legislation.
Great, thanks. Yeah, one thing we've actually have on our to-do list, hopefully in the next 6 months or so, is hold a defensible space course aimed at city and county planners that may not be all that familiar with the actual research that shows that providing defensible space and what that means as far as down to, mesh size on vents and that sort of thing, makes a difference in whether a home survives a wildfire or not. So that's one thing we're thinking about locally, of trying to bring everybody up on that same level of understanding for what defensible space really means and how detailed it is and what research is out there to back it up. So.
This is Anthony in Deschutes County. Just really quickly, Ed. You know, I'm actually in Deschutes County. We're actually quite fortunate because we have, a county forester, Ed Keith. We have Allison Green with Project Wildfire, and so we're fortunate that we have really a lot of expertise in-house, and that may not be the case for many jurisdictions. So one of the things I was going to recommend is, we got quite lucky 2 years ago, ended up partnering with the University of Oregon with their Community Service Center, and they, when our Sheriff's Office was doing an update of our natural hazards mitigation plan, one of the consultants was is a faculty member of the University of Oregon, and they ended up having some FEMA money, and they actually approached us and said, hey, would you be interested in a code audit? And so we ended up partnering with the University of Oregon, and they did a code audit and have made a number of recommendations for both our comprehensive plan and our zoning code. And again, we're fortunate in that for this upcoming fiscal year's budget, we have in the budget, we're going to bring on a senior planner to help tackle, what types of things do we need to amend in our zoning code to better address wildfire hazard. But I would recommend to jurisdictions that maybe don't have staffing, support, resources, reach out to university planning programs. You may be surprised at what type of expertise they can provide, beyond fire departments, or if you have advocacy groups, universities, colleges with planning programs may be able to assist in that process. Particularly in this case, like I said, we got lucky in that they had some FEMA money that they were able to use to do the code audit and help us out. And so over the next year or so, we may be able to undertake really a text amendment to update our code and provide much more detailed wildfire hazard measures for future development.
That's great advice from Anthony there in terms of utilizing the universities nearby. Ashland's been fortunate that we've used Southern Oregon University for a number of long-range planning actions, not necessarily wildfire, although they did do a review and recommendations on our proposed ordinance a year or so ago, but have used them for other long-range planning initiatives. As an individual course, the students can do quite a bit of background research on best practices used elsewhere, synthesize that and provide it back in a summary format to the planning department, which, if nothing else, saves the planning department a lot of time doing research and is, a step up in making code amendments.
Great, thank you. Probably have time for another question if somebody wants to pop one into the chat box or ask one. One other thing I was wondering that was kind of related to your presentation, Brandon, is, but I think it was mentioned in a couple others. Steve mentioned that they have a map as well, although it hasn't been adopted. But I've always puzzled about, we have like a wildfire overlay zone that's basically almost the entire county except for maybe a couple large reservoirs, and how to, not only make the map but get it adopted. Any approaches to how to get those maps so that, when you do apply code, that it's really where the risk warrants that extra step of or requirements are warranted. Any words of wisdom on how to develop those overlay zones or whatever you might call them?
This is Noah from Santa Fe. I would say that, the best way is to find, what's worked for us, and I bet it could probably work for other municipalities, is to find a map and an overlay with multiple purposes, not just, although while the WUI is important, and I would say give it more than one purpose and intent, you know, and so that it has multiple objectives. And then from there, you'll develop a set of regulations, and you can pull a set of regulations like we've done with our escarpment. So it's providing and protecting our mountainous and our steep slopes and our terrain and our view shed, but also at the same time, it's sustainable and safe building practices in terms of fire prevention. So that's what, you know, I would recommend.
And our method is probably counter to that. We actually have had a number of different overlays. We have a steep slope overlay that regulates development on steep slopes, a wildfire overlay that regulates development in that area, as well as floodplains or other physical environmental constraint restrictions or historic district overlays. And a lot of times those all overlap. And so there may be 4 different overlays that apply to an individual property, which does complicate matters, but is really how it's just been done. I think our overlay maps were largely adopted in the mid-'80s, including the wildfire overlay. And so that is really the conditions that we've been living with in terms of applying it moving forward. In terms of defining the area of risk, the fire department in Ashland produced a risk assessment that looked at, I think, 30 different neighborhoods within the city, I'm estimating, but identified source points where wildfire could initiate. And that was compelling when presented to our Planning Commission and City Council as to the need to expand the existing wildfire overlay area to include the entire city. That would be the only overlay zone that we have in the city that incorporates every property within our city limits. So at that point, the overlay designation becomes mute to an extent, but so that's really our experience in using that overlay and having the map expanded, having that scientific basis for why areas are at greater risk than others, I think was key in making the decision to look at expanding that limited area that we currently have adopted.